hear some words from the Spanish PSD ambassadors.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming here today to a very stimulating debate. Here, the Spanish permanent representation is not the first time which is holding such a meeting. I hope that you will enjoy. You have represented here not only friends, but first-class panelists to provoke your thoughts and to maybe debate with you. Whenever normally I don't read all these only simply summary of them. But this time I read through all of it. And I have seen a lot of provocations here to the people who are working in the machine, the PSC ambassadors, the people working in the European External Service, the Commission, and I am sure that you yourself have found as well a lot of stuff for discussion today. In a timely meeting today, it is timely because three reasons, I think. First, because we are witnessing the change of the team in the EAS. We have a new high representative, a new team that is supposed to continue and to improve the work done by the previous one. Because we all are in favor of Europe speaking with one voice, and you will see here how it's best the way we can get that. You will see here a lot of critique concerning the main tools and instruments that we are using here in our machinery. I mean, concerning the strategic partnerships and the comprehensive approach, which are other instruments in which we think we are very efficient, but from the outside, it is not that so. I think that a lot of spark, a lot of provocation coming from the side of our friends will be more than needed here, because those who are working with myself and most of you in the machinery, sometimes we are absorbed in our own day-to-day work without having this perspective and this strategic thinking that you are going to provide us with. I don't want to talk anymore because we cannot come here to listen to me, but to this panelist. I only want you to welcome to the Spanish Embassy permanent representation Ambassador Alfonso Dasis, who was supposed to be here today, could not make it because he was retained in Madrid for another purpose. So I can substitute him. Be welcome and listen carefully to these people because they have a lot of things to tell you. Thank you very much.
So the format will be, we'll have half an hour or so for interventions from the 6 panelists. We should then have about 45-50 minutes for debate from the floor after that, so we'll be wrapping up at around about 2 o'clock. So to kick off, we've got Mark Leonard, who is Director of the CFR, who I think is going to give a brief overview of the paper before we move into discussions of specific issues.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you to so many friends for coming along to what I hope will be a very interactive discussion. The reason we're here is because we think that it's a really important time for Europe. 5 years ago, when the new team was starting in Brussels, they were very quickly enveloped in the Euro crisis, and it was a while before there was even any bandwidth for foreign policy. So existential were the questions that came out of the Euro crisis. This time round, the new team is walked straight into a huge set of foreign policy crises. Geopolitics is back with a vengeance, and it feels like a good time also to think about what it is that Europe is in the world, what it is that we're trying to do, and also a good time to think about how the member states and the institutions work together. Because one of the other similarities, I think, with the Euro crisis is both that the Euro crisis showed that a lot of our basic assumptions about Europe and about economics were flawed, but it also showed that the relationship between the institutions in Brussels and the member states was not working as well as it could do, and as a result, the member states went on the ascendant, particularly at the beginning of the crisis. A lot of the crisis management was done intergovernmentally rather than through Brussels. And I think there's a similar sense with the foreign policy crises at the moment, where a lot seems to be being done by some of the big member states, some of the same member states that were very active on the Euro crisis, like Germany, have emerged as sort of, what's the word? Anyway, indispensable powers in terms of moving forward on these sorts of issues. So our paper is really trying to take a step back and think about how one might think about rebooting European foreign policy on 3 levels. First, at the level of ideas. Secondly, at the level of specific policies. And thirdly, in terms of this relationship between Brussels and the member states. But it's also a statement of intent for ECFR. This paper is an early salvo out of a big project that we're very happy to have engaged on with the Austrian Ministry for Defence and Sport, the Mercator Stiftung, and other partners. And we're very grateful to our Spanish host for hosting us today here, which will be a big project which will take place over the next year, which is really about thinking about how we reboot European foreign policy. But it's also about how we reboot ECFR in Brussels, because we've had a lot of experience of trying to work within the member states to Europeanise their foreign policies, but we've been maybe a bit less active in Brussels than we should have been, and we would like to. We will be here much more over the next period of time, and very much hope that everyone in this room will work with us and help us find a useful role in this increasingly active and vital centre for discussions about Europe's role in the world. So I'll just very briefly talk about the 3 things that we're trying to do. So the first is really at the level of ideas, and we kind of argue that there is a golden opportunity in the mandate from the European Council to set out a vision of the challenges that the EU faces and to engage member states in a discussion about how to resolve them. And a key part of actually making sure that's a worthwhile process is also to start killing some of the unhelpful concepts that have defined European foreign policy thinking in the past, but which have maybe outlived their useful purpose. And when Cathy Ashton started 5 years ago, there were 3 such concepts which were set out, which made a lot of sense at the time as a way of structuring our thinking about the world. The European neighbourhood, the idea of strategic partners, and the idea of crisis management through a comprehensive approach. And we think that all 3 of these concepts are now actually barriers to effective policy rather than useful frameworks for thinking about how we should engage with the world. The most obvious one is the idea of the European neighbourhood. Even before the Arab awakening turned sour and Russia annexed Crimea, there was a growing consensus in this city, I think, on the flaws in the policy, that it's too Eurocentric, too technocratic, too driven by instruments, that the 16 countries it brigades together have got very little in common with each other, that it's too self-regarding, it assumes that the neighbours want to become more like us, which they generally don't, rather than just getting more of what we have, which they a lot of them do want to have. And also that it was all done on the cheap. It was probably right to think about the 3 M's as our kind of most attractive offers to the countries in the southern neighbourhood after the Arab awakenings, but it turned out we didn't really want to give them money, access to markets, and we certainly didn't want to open our borders to anyone from the neighbourhood, at least not in the way that would have acted as a game changer for their domestic political decision making. But we argue that actually it goes much greater than, the challenge goes much beyond simple questions about how this policy is implemented, that there is a fundamental conceptual flaw at the heart of it. And that's one of the dangers of just launching a review of the European neighbourhood policy and having a commissioner for enlargement in the neighbourhood policy. Because the whole idea of the European neighbourhood claims both too much and too little. It claims too much because although we have neighbours and we care a lot about our neighbours, this is not a neighbourhood. There's nothing in common between Ukraine and Morocco. Even between Morocco and Iraq, there's very little in common. So these people don't think of themselves, they might think of themselves as neighbours to some European countries. No one thinks of themselves as part of a European neighbourhood. There's very little desire from any of these countries to adopt EU norms by buying into a kind of enlargement light framework. And anyway, as we discussed, we're not actually offering them enough to actually change their calculus of interest. We're being outspent 10 to 1 by Saudi Arabia in Egypt, in every country that you can think about. But there are other players apart from the European Union. So therefore, it claims far too much by talking about a European neighbourhood. But it also claims too little, because this obsession with the neighbourhood also condemns the EU to be a regional power rather than a global power. And though A lot of these countries have, because of migration, because of energy, because of other relations, we do have some interest in these places. If you think about the long-term economic future of most of the European Union, it's not going to be coming from this part of the world. And if we're focusing on them to the exclusion of wider, of the rest of the world, particularly countries that are growing fast, that would be a misallocation of our long-term resources. So that's the first goal. I'm sure we can have an interesting discussion about that. The second conceptual concept, which I think is getting in the way, is the idea of the strategic partnership. Mogherini has already spoken very clearly about how thinking about Russia as a strategic partner maybe didn't capture the whole nature of the relationship at the time. But maybe that partnership thinking goes some way to explain how dramatically we failed to anticipate Russia's reactions to Ukraine signing an association agreement with us last autumn. Also, obviously, Francois will talk more about how maybe strategic partner doesn't capture the whole relationship with a China that is not becoming more like us, that is a great state capitalist superpower that thinks about the world in very different ways from the way that we do. And Nick can also maybe talk about how even with the US, which is clearly a strategic partner, the term doesn't necessarily actually help us develop the sort of relationship that we need going forward with an America that increasingly wants Europeans to stand on their own 2 feet and to take more responsibility for things which are going on in their part of the world, whilst they, trying, though not necessarily succeeding, to pivot further towards the Pacific. And the final concept that we think is unhelpful is the idea of the comprehensive approach to crisis management, which Nick Whitney convincingly argues has provided a smokescreen behind which the EU's CSDP has virtually collapsed. He can maybe talk more about that later on. So that's the first level, is this conversation about what is going on in the world and what concepts do we need to engage with it. The second challenge we think is that it's important for the new team to develop some symbolic interventions that show seriousness of intent on these questions. And on page 5 of the paper, we have a sort of menu for Mogherini of things that could be done going forward towards different parts of the world. I'm not going to run through them all because we have very little time. So I'll end with the third set of issues which we raise in there, which is the need to craft a new relationship between the EU institutions and the member states on the big issues that we're facing based on a new division of labour. And I think that one of the really surprising features of the post-Lisbon setup here is the fact that the relationship between the EU institutions and the member states has not changed in a positive way over the last 5 years. So a decade ago, when the Orange Revolution erupted in Ukraine, there were member states that went to deal with it, but they also did bring Javier Solana along as a symbol of and a focus of European unity. The same was true when we started negotiations over a decade ago with Iran on the nuclear program. It was not driven by Brussels, but it was very important that quite quickly that Javier Solana was brought along and empowered to provide some European unity on those affairs. It's quite striking that when the Weimar foreign ministers went to deal with this unfolding situation in Kiev earlier in the year, they didn't bother bringing anyone from Brussels along, and that's just one of many examples. Britain and France, for example, when they're thinking about what to do with Syria, have not been over active in engaging with the EU institutions or other member states. And this fragmentation is sort of understandable in some ways, but it's often quite self-defeating, because one of the problems of member states going it alone is that it makes it much more difficult to leverage the power that can come from the EU's market, whether it's in positive terms through trade deals or negative ones through sanctions, aid, or even just the attention span that's needed to take these issues forward. If you look at Iran, we may or may not get a comprehensive deal on the 24th of November, but it certainly hasn't been a quick process, and it's a process that has been so slow that it's just quite difficult for member states to engage for that length of time on a difficult issue. So in the paper we kind of think about some ways forward. We think it's very good that Jean-Claude Juncker has restructured the Commission and is trying to get the RELEX group of commissioners to work together, which could give the new High Rep maybe a bit more control over some of the levers that we have in terms of within the Commission. But even more important than that, I think is going to be the relationship between the Commission as a whole and the Member States. And there are three sort of ideas that we float in there, which we can talk about at greater length. But the first is that we think it'd be very important for Mrs. Mogherini to go on a set of joint trips with some of the key foreign ministers to different regions to establish a different way of working and to show that EU foreign policy doesn't necessarily have to be all 28 member states plus the European institutions, but there are more flexible ways of making a real European foreign policy. Secondly, we think that she should tap into the talent of the member states in this review and not just have it led by the EAS, but rather actually have small working groups of member states working in an informal way with foreign ministers in the lead to prepare some of the key policy dossiers. What comes in the wake of the ruins of the European neighbourhood policy when it comes to dealing with the Mediterranean and North Africa and that region that is in chaos. The same could be true of Eastern Europe, how to deal with Ebola or other kind of questions. And thirdly, we think that it would be very helpful as part of that process to have some franker discussions about what issues can and should be subjected to the discipline of common approaches and what should be left to national capitals. Because nothing's going to stop member states competing for arms contracts in Riyadh or investment from China, and nor should it. At the same time, maybe we can agree some sort of rules of the game so that that competition doesn't necessarily destroy the possibility for a common strategy in areas where we do share interests. So those are a few ideas to get the discussion rolling, but the real expertise lies in my colleagues who will go into much greater depth and be more sparkling and original on the areas that I kind of glossed over in that overview.
Thank you very much, Mark. So we're going to kick off with Kadri Lee, who is a Senior Policy Fellow at the ECFR working in the Wider Europe programme. Kadri is going to speak in particular on Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you. There's a microphone for you. That's on. Is it on?
It is now.
It is now. Good. I hope you can hear me. Well, when we were planning for that meeting, we discussed that we should try to arrange our presentations around challenges and opportunities in our respective regions. And in mind, the challenge is obviously enormous. Our eastern neighbourhood that used to be the focus of Eastern Partnership policy, that focused in its turn on modernization, democratization. Therefore, it was often somewhat frustrating, also somewhat boring, let's be honest. Now suddenly, Eastern neighbourhood is the place where the very principles of liberal European order will be either reinforced or revised. Because what Russia wants, Russia does not want Donbass. It does not even want frozen conflict there. It might want the frozen conflict as a liberation like here. But above all, Russia wants to change the rules of the game in Europe. Russia wants not just to restore, but also re-legitimize spheres of influence as an organizing principle of international life in Europe. And Russia wants us to accept it and subscribe to it, and basically carve up the respective spheres of influence. And we need to find a meaningful answer to that challenge. We need to have that conversation with Russia in one form or other. There is no escaping that long term. But we cannot possibly accept Russia's terms. At the same time, we are not yet in the position to impose our terms on Russia. And the actual challenge, I think, long term really is changing Russia's view of the world, Russia's understanding of how international affairs ought to be conducted, making Russia a little bit more like ourselves. But this is very long term. Basically, this is what we have been trying to do for the last 20 years. All our institutional arrangements with Russia are based on assumption that several decades, Russia will democratize, modernize, and become the sort of country with whom Europe can have a fruitful relationship. That has not happened. Instead of converting to accept the values of the organizations it has joined, such as Council of Europe or G8, Russia has actually ended up corrupting these organizations. So we also need to think through our own institutional arrangements and cooperation formats with Russia. The geopolitical discussion is the biggest challenge, of course, because Europe is not well equipped to deal with that. I mean, we don't think in geopolitical terms, and we are proud that we do not, and that's rightly so in many ways. So when it comes to opportunities, I think we have managed to impress Russia somewhat with our sanctions. Russia didn't expect that from us. Sanctions are hurting Russia, and they are already influencing Russia's calculations in many ways, both more positive for us and more negative. But I think what has really enhanced our credibility in Russia's eyes is the fact that we have shown that we are ready to take some pain ourselves as well. That is what my Russian friends always have been saying to me ever since March when sanctions were first discussed. As long as Europe is not prepared to take any economic sacrifices itself, Moscow will not take you seriously. Now they are taking us a lot more seriously than was the case a year ago or even as late as this spring. But the challenge for us now is to use this newly acquired credibility and turn it into a diplomatic tool, turn it a policy tool that would allow us to shape at least some of these outcomes. I do not think that the whole complex of issues that is on the desk between us and Russia can be solved quickly and using that single leverage of sanctions. But we should think, how do we instrumentalize the sanctions? What do we intend to achieve with sanctions? And how do we go about it? Which sorts of diplomatic tools we use? How and when? Timings are also important, because we didn't have that much time. Sanctions were not in July, and before that they will be lame duck. So it's maybe 6 months that we have to make a difference. But we have a chance. We are taken much more seriously in Russia than has been the case for many, many years, I would say.
Thanks very much. So we're now turning to Julian Barnes-Dacey, who is also a Senior Policy Fellow at ECFR, working in the Middle East North Africa Programme, previously worked in Syria. Julian will be speaking on Middle East and North Africa.
Thanks, Tom. Let me be brief and just throw out a couple of comments. And I want to look particularly at the Syria-ISIS element of the equation, because I think that's the most pertinent, that's the most urgent of the many crises in the Middle East, but clearly the one with the most dramatic relevance and the one in which a strategy is in the process of being formulated. Perhaps there's still room to work on that. And just to make 2 points, and the first, I think, is the urgent necessity, danger of falling back into the war on terror narrative and response. And I think it's perhaps symbolic that yesterday marked the end of the US-British military operations in Afghanistan after more than a decade. And we see where that country is today. And I think there's a real danger at the moment that the response in both Iraq and Syria is both being framed but also acted upon through a similar lens, which frankly will be counterproductive, won't work, is already failing on the ground in terms of what we see in Syria, in terms of the realignments of groups, in terms of the narrative that groups like ISIS are playing off as a bombing campaign up the ante in Iraq and Syria. And I think to pivot off that, the key focus needs to be one of encouraging and moving towards an assumption of greater regional responsibility in terms of dealing with this crisis. This is a crisis that has emerged out of the rubbles of the Arab political system. It's about the political disorder, it's about the lack of Sunni leadership that we see amongst the different communities on the ground. And it's only really at a moment when those key countries on the ground involved, from the likes of Iran to Saudi, to some of the religious leaders and movements, actually step up and take responsibility, that we're going to have any hope of addressing that. And in one sense, one says, well, look, that's a lost cause. Look, we've seen Syria for 3 years, we've seen the Arab Spring, give me a break, that's not an option. But it's quite interesting if one looks at Lebanon and one looks at Iraq, and one looks at how the countries have responded since ISIS really jumped to the fore of the agenda about 6 months ago, a year ago. In both of those countries, you've actually seen a very unlikely and unprecedented convergence of regional interests. And you've seen the likes of Iran and Saudi pushing together in surprising ways in Iraq and in Lebanon to create solutions because they're both threatened by this threat. And my real fear for Syria, which is the epicenter of the whole crisis, is that we are taking that threat away from them. By intervening, by framing it through a war on terror narrative, we run the risk of actually stemming the opportunity, misusing the opportunity, throwing the opportunity away by actually managing their danger for them. And it's interesting that already both of them have converted what was a threat ISIS posed both to the Assad regime, but also to the moderate Sunnis represented by the FSA, who are close to the likes of Saudi. Suddenly that's no longer a threat for the country, it's an opportunity. And I think it's a real danger, and I think it's something that Europe really needs to think about very carefully. How its response doesn't fall back on these blunt tools and actually squander the opportunity of regional convergence around the shared threat. The second quick point is on the ticking time bomb of refugees. And this is something that perhaps Europe has more room to maneuver given the political dynamics of the grand geopolitics of the region. But it really is a ticking time bomb in terms of the stability of all the neighboring countries, in terms of the room for radicalization, in terms of migration, and it's frankly something that is being completely ignored. And I think if the challenge is really thinking about how you forge a regional consensus in a very difficult environment, the opportunity, if there is any for Europe, I think would be on the humanitarian refugee track, where there is so much that needs to be done, and so little attention being paid for the moment. So let me just leave it at that for the moment, and then happy to pick up on more of it later.
Thanks, Julian. Turning to François Godemont, who is Director of the Asia and China Programme. Thank you so far, and that's it.
Thanks. I hope this is working, yes. I'll try to be quick, so in the interest of the discussion. What is still valid and what doesn't work for the next team in the European institutions towards Asia? I think Asia has changed a lot in the past 2 years. It all comes from China, but there are lots of consequences. And so let me enumerate the issues. First of all, we have a simmering conflict about territorial issues, and in the back, the temptations of revisionism on post-war deals or implicit oblivion of the issues, deferring them into the future. This is now very general. It is striking that there is no political or diplomatic alliance within Asia. The US has bilateral links, there are understandings, but on the whole, intra-regional solutions, not very effective. Our answer to this has been a mirror of the American answer, except of course we don't have the beef. So our answer is we have no answer on sovereignty. That should be welcome because it means we're quote-unquote neutral. The problem is the US is maybe neutral on the sovereignty issues, but with a lot of aircraft carriers, and we don't have them. We have no hard power. So once we've said we have no beef in that quarrel, and since we have no hard power, we turn to the second mantra, which is about resolution by law, international law as a guiding principle. Very interesting, but not really taken up by the most concerned Asians. I don't only mean the Chinese, but even the Koreans or the Vietnamese, for example. And as we know, the Japanese have had a lot of hesitation in practice about recognizing the existence of problems. So international law is a good way for us to keep us out of trouble, but is not a good way to make us more influential. The influence starts with either the security that we might provide or the bargaining on which we might lead. The security is right now, although Europe doesn't know it, increasingly provided by European nation states. The share of the US weapon, of the Asian weapons market that's provided by Europe is steadily increasing and may increase even more in the future. That is, you could call it an indirect alliance. You could even say that, in effect, if Europe is saying nothing, if this is happening, Europe is actually taking side. There are dangers there. Just think of the disarray 10 years ago on the arms embargo issue with China and what could happen if these things came to a test, if there was a semblance of a conflict. So I would argue that this requires for the EU to exist more position at the EU level, more involvement. I think that's very important. Second issue, closely tied with what we discussed about Russia and Ukraine, we have competing and perhaps even adverse interest with our very friends in East Asia. Our very friends in East Asia need to be able to distinguish between China and Russia. They need to be able to make deals with Russia because to them the most pressing problem and also the most important long-term problem is not Russia, it's China. With our sanctions policy, we try and commit them while we don't have any opinion on their own quarrels. You won't be surprised that even if Japan, and to some extent Korea a few weeks ago, finally gives in to criticism and condemnation of what Russia did in Ukraine and takes a few moves, it's essentially because the US, the hard power, asks it, not because Europeans ask for it. And we do have a problem that what we think is a very smart policy, sanctions which are in place of what I would call red lines on the sand, are either not taken very seriously by many Asians who think that in essence Europe is not moving, or worse, that it runs counter to their own strategic interests, which lie with Russia in part as a complementary, of course, to the hedging with the US. So we have a problem there, and we will have to discuss frankly, I think, with a number of major Asian countries, what do we do in exchange for sanctions? What is the take? Why do we want them involved? What are we ready to give them in many areas, so that an effective dialogue is there. I think being naive about it or just relying on the American pivot is not going to do wonder for us in the long term. So there is a need for strategizing, and again, member states of the EU are not well placed to do this because everybody knows they don't control the whole situation. Take just one example. If the 16 Central and Eastern European countries that occasionally meet with China, they have a summit coming on in December, discussed upfront with China the Ukraine or Crimea situation, that would be progress. That would be a kind of leverage which would demultiply European policy. If they don't, a power such as China understands very quickly that in spite of the urgency of Ukraine and Crimea, business is even more important. I turn to business just for a second theme, which I will just run very shortly. We know we haven't been taken very seriously by the Chinese in terms of our bilateral investment treaty negotiations or macroeconomic dialogue for several years. They often did not meet. They in fact thought they already had what they needed in the European market, and the problem we have with them is that we may need these things more than they do because we have offensive interests in a very defensive Chinese economy, while our economy is quite open. The DG Trade, under the previous commissioner, has staged what I would call a brave rearguard fight to be taken seriously, and to some extent has succeeded. Even the solar panel issue, which is poo-pooed by many member states, has actually shown a compromise, and let me tell you, on dumping issues, China doesn't compromise that often. The problem is to move from that to the next stage, and we cannot remain locked in the sequential, chronological attitude, which is you do a BIT with us first, and then we'll be thinking about market economy, about a free market deal, a free trade deal, because both are going to be urgent, because our Chinese partners know that at the member state level, people, as Mark rightly said, are clamoring for investment, because it's in our interest to have some of these investments. So we have to get moving. We have to find a more active strategy, one that commits the various member states to defend these offensive interests in China, because unfortunately, the EU up to now, up to this day, has been more about defensive interests than offensive interests. The offensive interests very often belong to the member states or to the companies that articulate them, while the defensive interests is something that the EU has been very well equipped about. In the coming stage, we will need to fuse both. We will need to be more creative. And I would end by saying that I am not sure that the TTIP or even the TPP, those two Obama administration designs, will come to fruition very quickly. But there are extraordinary ideas to sort of set the stage and impulse a dynamic. Europe has its free trade deals with country X, Y, Z, doesn't have an overarching concept that it could sell to some of its partners, particularly in Asia, particularly to create competition between China and the other economies towards Europe, which I think is our last leverage with China. Stop there.
Thank you, first one. Moving to Nick Whitney, who is a former head of the European Defence Agency and is running ECFR's global strategy project, of which this paper forms an important part. Nick.
Thank you. Am I on? I'll just speak up, shall I? Anyway. And I think what my various colleagues have said, the thread running through this is very much the thrust of the paper, which is an appeal for two things, really. An appeal for greater realism, a greater readiness to engage with the world as it is, rather than as it maybe was 10 years ago, and as we profoundly wish it still was today, but an appeal for greater realism and an appeal for a more strategic approach. And strategy, of course, is a slippery word. It gets you straight into arguments about what is that a paper and how does it relate to ways and means. And frankly, I don't find these very rewarding discussions. I'm entirely agnostic as to whether we need a new European security strategy or not. But the idea of trying to step back from the inevitably reactive, crisis-driven, day-to-day preoccupations of foreign policy within the Brussels Ring Road and to take stock a little bit more is, seems to me, profoundly important at this stage. We talked about challenges and opportunities, picking up the words from the Council mandate to Mogherini, and I suggest that the fundamental challenge we all face is simply trying to hang on to what we've got. I mean, Europe has lived high on the hog for 500 years, and it's been great. But now we are fundamentally challenged, both in terms of those things we hold most dear, our prosperity and our security. And perhaps we're a little bit more aware of the economic challenges we face, but if we're going to continue to have a global trading environment which suits us, to protect our intellectual property and our technology, to insist on those standards which prevent us being undercut by countries that don't care about, to the same extent, about social and environmental standards, to ensure that our sources of raw materials for this energy, natural resource per continent, are still available in deep and liquid markets. All these things are going to require more effort in the future. I think even perhaps more importantly and less appreciated is the extent to which our beloved global order is under challenge. And the thing about what Putin is doing is not just Ukraine. It's about the ideological challenge he's put down to us, the espousal of spheres of influence, the denial of the concepts of personal empowerment, the blatant ethno-nationalism. And if we think that's just Putin, we're entirely wrong. I mean, he's such a popular man in China. The Chinese leadership so sympathized with this concept that there are color revolutions. Isn't that a wonderfully old-fashioned phrase? Very current. Current color revolutions inspired by the CIA in Hong Kong, running around the world. This is all a Western conspiracy. This, of course, is a doctrine which is very well received in increasingly large parts of the Arab world, in Cairo and Riyadh. We have to accept that the way we've seen the world, our approach to liberal democracy, is losing ground. There are fewer democracies today than there were 6 years ago. There are many more conflicts than there were 3 years ago. And we're going to have to work harder if we're going to try to ensure that people whose positions are perhaps less clear, India, Brazil, Africa, weigh in on our side of the debate. This is going to require thinking strategically, and I'll sign off with the opportunity. Of course, the great opportunity is precisely this mandate that Mogherini has picked up to think about opportunities and challenges. And I was very encouraged to hear, or rather to read what she had to say to the European Parliament in her written responses to their questions before her hearings, when she talked about the need for words here, comprehensive stock-taken reflection and wide-ranging and inclusive debate, and the need to try to move us towards a shared strategic outlook. Easier said than done, but that, it seems to me, is the huge opportunity we have in the coming months. And I don't know how that this falls to the EAS and Mogherini's closest advisors, but I'd be fascinated to hear from you if anyone can throw light on how this process is to be taken forward, because nothing could be more timely, or I suggest more important.
Thank you, Nick. Our last speaker is Josef Yanni, who works in ECFR's Berlin office. Josef is going to speak on the role of the member states, and I think particularly on Germany.
Yes, thanks very much, Tom. I'd like to begin with one of Frank-Walter Steinmeier, German Foreign Minister's favorite analogies these days. When he speaks here and there, he often uses the term to describe, international disorder by saying that, and I call that in German, die Welt ist aus den Fugen geraten, which doesn't translate very easily, but it, because it allows several interpretations, but it basically is to say that the international order doesn't fit realities, or our view of international order doesn't fit realities, some point that Nick struck. And what Steinmeier means is that there are actors breaking the rules, leaving their place, as leaving the spot that they are kind of properly controlling. Actors outgrowing order, outgrowing the role they have in that order. And also the idea that order itself could be losing plausibility, and because of that also losing legitimacy. Something that when Berlin looks at the Middle East comes to mind quite often. So in many of those reflections that build on such a perception of the world, then Europe is usually, in Berlin, seen as one of the places to answer. We need more Europe to defend our interests, that's one of the conclusions, and to promote our idea of how things should be. I think at the same time it has never been more difficult in Berlin to draw that conclusion, because I think a lot of people are aware, not just in Berlin but in other capitals as well, that foreign ministers have been saying this for 40 years. 40 years we have made that point, seeking to legitimize European political cooperation from its beginnings to where we are today, and still haven't managed. I think one of the reasons is, and I think Germany is indicative of that, one of the reasons is that a capital like Berlin has probably never been more sober on the functionalist assumption than ever. The general reading seems to be, in Berlin as well as in many other capitals, that member states matter more. That the idea of building institutions, equipping them, and assigning tasks to them, and then they will go off and create a momentum of themselves which will draw along member states, I think has fewer fans, fewer believers in capitals than it ever has. And somehow the trajectory set by the Lisbon Treaty doesn't quite, fit that situation. And so as I read member state positions, and I don't speak for all of the member states, so obviously, one of the crucial expectations of member states vis-a-vis
EU or the high rep is not that it overcomes all that and somehow gets us out of that trouble, but rather much more pragmatic. The question, could the next High Representative deliver the combined resources of the European Union to the foreign policy needs of the Europeans? If the High Rep could do that, it would have a good standing. If it couldn't, it would be another disappointment. So Germany and a couple of other member states still place good hopes on the cluster approach because they understood that being the only policy field that was supposed to be clustered in the previous commission didn't work. So now, if it could become the operating mode of the commission, then also the foreign policy cluster might have a chance to get stabbed in the back less than it was the case before. But I would also add that member states need to be aware that if they reduce their expectations to that level of pragmatism, they should also need to become prepared for more member state interaction. And I think this goes in particular for Germany at a time when the foreign minister himself has declared a major policy review, a foreign policy review for Germany. Seems to me that the current selectivism that also Germany applies does not suffice. And by selectivism I mean working with the as big three at times, working with France at other times, somehow rediscovering the Weimar Triangle at still other times, but not following through many of these, will not be a recipe for the foreign policy of the country that Mark earlier has described as an indispensable player. I think Germany will need to rediscover its own neighborhood ring of friends, which is not just those countries that I've mentioned, but in particular those which happen to be mostly immediate neighbors of Germany, rather affluent, with quite distinctive interests in terms of security and prosperity in that state, often marginalized in the process, neither represented in the G20 nor the G7, but still considerably clustering a considerable amount of wealth and being neglected by Berlin for the past decade. I think if Germany wants to use this kind of member state line and this member state window that there certainly is in the EU's foreign policy, this was one of the principal layers to rediscover.
Thank you. So we should have about 45 minutes for questions. I'm going to abuse my role as a moderator and take the first question myself. Just a theme that came up in a couple of the points, Nick's and Kadri's, on Putin's desire not simply to establish a frozen conflict in the Donbass, to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty, whatever it is, but to fundamentally change the international order, to rewrite the rules of the game, essentially. And it's striking to hear about that in the light of the speech that he gave last week in Sochi, one of the things that struck me, I was just reading it this morning, was that if you make your way through the whole thing, it's rather long, there's very little about Europe, very little about the European Union there, rather a lot more about the United States. What does that tell us about the way that Putin understands the role of Europe, the Brussels institutions, the member states, in rewriting, as he might like to see it, the rules of the game, versus how we might see the United States?
Yes, reading Putin is always an interesting endeavor. He has been pretty consistent in his messages, but it is true that he lives in a world of his own, as Angela Merkel put it. He lives in a parallel world, but the problem is that much of Russia lives in that same world. His views are shared by the bulk of Russia's foreign policy making establishment. So it's not that I believe that Putin was kind of mad. or even his sort of KGB fraternity that is undoubtedly affected by our education, that contributes to certain groupthink, certain way of viewing the world. That is all that. But the same way is actually shared by much wider circles of policy makers and experts. And really, they think that spheres of influence actually exist, and everything the West does is done with an aim of expanding our sphere of influence. Our denials are seen as just hypocrisy and even insulting. He thinks that we don't want to have a proper conversation with Moscow discussing the rules and the spheres. We are kind of answering in a stupid, hypocritical way, pretending that we're not doing the things that they think we're doing. And they see often Europe as being United States lapdog, effectively. They suspect United States and NATO expansion being behind everything. But the trouble is that even if we manage to convince them that this is not so, even if we manage to sign a NATO declaration declaring that Georgia and Ukraine will never become NATO members, as opposed to the 2008 declaration that said they will, they still won't be happy because problem runs deeper. I think Putin cannot really deal with democratic neighbors because he doesn't know how to interact with democratically elected leaders and the constraints they face on their actions. He is at home with authoritarian leaders, and this is where his soft power works, on authoritarian leaders in both East and West, actually. If you look at where he has friends in the West, it's quite a clear picture. So I would argue that if these countries in the Eastern neighborhood manage to become functioning democracies, then regardless of their sort of explicit geopolitical orientation, it will still be a problem for Moscow. They still feel they are aliens simply because they speak an alien language of democracy that Moscow doesn't understand and thinks it's hypocritical. It's sort of our hypocritical language that they would be adopting.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that a bit. I mean, I think the real people who, unfortunately, I've had I was in Japan a bit earlier this year, and I had a real epistemic breakthrough and finally understood what's going on in terms of the global order. Like many people in Brussels, I used to think that what we were doing here was not just building an important political community amongst ourselves, but in some way laying claim to the future of the world. I wrote a book about 10 years ago called Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, in which I claim that the European way of doing things will increasingly become the world's way of doing things, and that's what I meant by European century, our postmodern approach, not using force against each other, not having balanced power, spheres of influence, different approach to sovereignty. And I argued then that it would spread in four kind of main ways: through enlargement, through our transformation of our neighbourhood, through the creation of global institutions that embodied these values, like the ICC and the Kyoto Protocol, I think was big in those days, and other kinds of institutions. And fourthly, because this would set off a kind of regional domino effect, and every other region would have to do what we were doing. If not, they would not be competitive anymore. And what I realise now is that actually everything I said about what we built being great was right. I think what we have got is amazing. I'd rather live in Europe, the European Union, than anywhere else in the world. I'd rather bring up kids here than anywhere else in the world. However, if you leave Europe, very few people see their future in the terms that I've just described. And I didn't see it totally clearly until I went to Japan, because in Japan they had a similar thing with their technology about 10 years ago. They were really puzzled that their third generation of mobile phones was so much better than anyone else's in the world, and yet nobody in the world was interested in buying them. Like how could this be? Because the whole notion of capitalism is that you have is the ultimate Darwinian system. You see the survival of the fittest. So the very best things would kind of spread all over the world, and everyone would follow them, and they would have global markets, and they'd kill all the dysfunctional, less good competition in other parts of the world. And then actually it was through Darwin that they understood what was going on. They came up with this concept which every Japanese taxi driver can tell you about now, which is the idea of the Galapagos syndrome. It's the idea that Japan's mobile phones are these perfect kind of thing, but it's gone down an evolutionary, a separate evolutionary path which is disconnected from the mainland. And the gulf has become so wide now, it's unbridgeable. So it's actually too good to succeed. Nobody's going to catch up with Japanese third-generation mobile phone technology. So we'll forever live in a different world from Japan, technologically. And I think the same is true of the European order. What we've developed is a Galapagos order. It works perfectly for us, it's wonderful. Doesn't work too well, a bit like the Galapagos finches, if you kind of expose it to other parts of the world. As we saw in Crimea. It's not necessarily that robust, but amongst ourselves it works wonderfully. And I think there is that leads to a profound change in how we think about advancing this order, because what I thought, what other people thought, was that we had a world order for export, that we would only be able to live our principles when the whole world was living like us, and that we were the future. And that therefore we should think about enlargement, all these other things. But actually what I now realise is what we built is quite fragile and very precious and needs to be protected from the rest of the world, rather than expecting the rest of the world who don't necessarily want it to kind of adopt it. So if you think about our relationship with Russia and the European neighbourhood, we had this unipolar idea of the European neighbourhood where there was just our order. You know, maybe not everyone would be in the European Union, but they would basically sign up to it. And they would do deals with us, and we might have the 4 spaces with Russia rather than them having the 4 freedoms, the European neighbourhood policy, etc. But we were basically the kind of rules of the game. What I now realise is that actually, if we want to keep what we have, which is what Nick was talking about, we need to think about how you protect it from other people. That means that actually we need to rethink the European order so that you have different projects going on. And what other projects can we live with? We can't live with a Russia that's trying to create spheres of influence, that's trying to go back to the kind of balance of power in a traditional way. But we can't also pretend that they're going to be part of the European Union, because they're not going to be part of the European Union. And where we made a fundamental mistake was crushing other ideas for projects which Russia was trying to develop. Actually, the idea of a Eurasian Union is something we should be encouraging rather than killing, because that is a project we could live with. You could have a European Union and an economic Eurasian Union, which live together and build a relationship with each other. But we also need to think about what are the other institutions which are really central to this European way of doing things. I think the Council of Europe is one of them. I don't think you can have a country like Russia in the Council of Europe, because it destroys the whole idea of it. It doesn't sign up to the founding principles of this institution. That is a values-based institution. So I think we need to reconfigure our order, but think more about what we can do to strengthen the foundations of what we have, which is so special, how we strengthen the sovereignty of countries around us. But we, I think, need to move out of this idea where we have a universal thing that everyone's going to be part of, and realise that we're exceptional and value our exceptionalism. And if people, anyway, so I think it's a fundamentally different mindset. I haven't even started to think through what all the implications are, but it does mean quite a big rethink of everything that we're doing. I think that's one of the problems with the European neighbourhood policy, actually, because it's based on a paradigm which is no longer true, which is this assumption everyone's going to be like us. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's fine. Just before I turn it to the floor, I don't know if anyone else on this side has some interesting big breakthroughs that they'd like to share on this or anything else. Okay, well, question from the floor, please.
Okay, right. Stephen Everett, the EAS. Well, first of all, thanks to Nick and everybody else for writing really a terrific piece. Really, it's a terrific piece, because there's so much that's being written on this subject. There's so much that is garbage, and here comes along to a paper that is crisp, that is sharp, that is full of realism, and it's brimming with new ideas. So I really enjoyed that, and I think you do a good service to all of us by sort of debunking some of these concepts. And Mark's the one on the road right now, destroying his own thesis of 10 years ago. I mean, it really, so that's good. Now, just a couple of comments. Many people on the circuit now make this analogy that you're also making. Look, you had the euro crisis, existential crisis, and we somehow sort of came through it by